Okay. Hi, everyone. We're just letting everybody in, so just bear with us. You're all very, very welcome. We are recording the meeting, so if you would prefer to have your camera off, that's absolutely fine with us. My name is Brenda Drum. I'm Head of Communications with Mercy International Association, and I have a few bits of housekeeping when we let a few more people in, and then I'll be handing you over to Caroline Thompson. You can see on screen there. I'll be leaving you in her capable hands. So in the meantime, I'm just keeping an eye on the waiting room and letting more people in. You're very welcome wherever you are in the Mercy world. Um, and most of you, I think, at this stage, most people in the Mercy world, I hope at this stage, know that we are on the path to the anniversary of the opening, the founding of the first House of Mercy by Catherine McAuley. We'll be celebrating that formally on the 24th of September next year, but we're already doing lots of lovely different things to mark the anniversary year, including this heritage series. So, in terms of housekeeping, as I said, this meeting is being recorded. All of you are muted at the moment, but we don't want you to stay mute. We want you to use the chat. We want you to share where you are in the world, say hello to each other, and we want you to share comments and questions as you go. Because we've had a large number of registrants, it's just not possible to have everybody off mute, but we will. If you want to come on and ask a question in person, we'll certainly bring you off mute. If you have any technical issues, you can message me in the chat and I'll do my best to help you. And we think we will get started now. I'm going to hand you over and place you in Caroline's capable hands. So thanks again for being with us. I'll keep an eye on the chat. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Brenda, and welcome everyone. I can't see you all at the moment because I've got the screen sharing, but I hope you can all see the screen, and it's great to be here. As Brenda said, we are moving into our preparation for the celebration of the 200th anniversary of the opening of the House of Mercy, and we thought it would be a great idea to do a series of heritage talks on the house, the reason Catherine built the house, how she built the house, where she built the house, why she built the house. So this is what this heritage series is about. So hopefully, the first one on the penal laws, as you would know. I'm now going to try and make the screen sharing work. Sorry, Brenda, I can't get the thing to move. Here. Sorry, everyone. Technology always lets you down.
Yeah, just give it a second. It's loading for us, so we're on the. If you go into slideshow mode.
I am in slideshow mode, but I think because I've got half the screen, it's not working particularly well. Anyway, I'd like to just start with Catherine McAuley's world. We know Catherine McAuley was an Irish woman who was moved to respond to the enormous challenges of her time and to help those made poor, especially women, the elderly, and children. And we know, of course, that she focused particularly on education. But the question for this particular presentation is, why were Irish Catholics living in such extreme poverty? That's the question we want to focus on today. The answer to that, of course, is the penal laws. And we know that from around about the late 1600s, laws were passed against Roman Catholics and Protestant dissenters in Britain and Ireland. The laws in Ireland, in particular, penalised the practice of the Roman Catholic religion and imposed civil disabilities on Catholics, forcing Catholics and others to accept the Anglican Church, Church of Ireland. They were gradually repealed and had been largely removed by the time of around about 1829. But in the meantime, they had done enormous damage. And that's what I want to talk about today, the damage done by the penal laws and what the laws were and why they had come into effect in the first place. So that's the topic of today's conversation. Some of the people who were writing about the penal laws said things like this. Edmund Burke, who's a very well-known historian, he said the declared object was to reduce the Catholics in Ireland to a miserable populace without property, without estimation, and without education. Another historian of the time, William Lecky, said it was a distinguishing characteristic of the Irish Penal Code that its victims constituted at least 3/4 of the nation, and that it was intended to demoralise as well as degrade. It was intended to make them poor and keep them poor and to crush them in every germ of enterprise, to degrade them into a servile caste who would never hope to rise to the level of their oppressors. Pretty sad reading, really, isn't it? But, the words demoralise and crush are part of the intention of the law. Can I make the slides larger, says Mary. Can we make the slides larger, Brenda?
Anybody who wants to make the slides larger can go, there's a button called view options on your screen, and you can go up by 100% or 150%. There you go. Yeah.
Oh.
So I'm seeing them now in full size.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So why did they have penal laws? Mm-hmm. I think I can see them bigger now too. We know that successive English kings had attempted to exert control over Ireland for the usual reasons. And let's have a look at those. Ireland is very close to England, and it had large plantations that were selling goods into England, Scotland, and the need for power and control over that supply was one reason. Another reason was fear. The English feared having a large Irish Catholic population on their doorstep. One of the reasons they feared it is that they had only recently, if you think about the history, it was Henry VIII who turned England from a Catholic country to an Anglican country, and then one of his daughters turned it back again. So they had hundreds of years of destabilization around religious identity. They had finally got to the late 1600s where the Anglican Church was firmly in control in England, yet they had this large Irish country on their doorstep. There was a general feeling amongst the English, and I think the English have basically had this attitude for a long time. They certainly showed it in India. They used it in Australia over the Indigenous people, that they were the civilized people and they were there to bring culture to everyone else. They saw the Irish as below them, basically. They were large, the Irish population at that time. We're talking here about the late 1600s, early 1700s. It was a largely agrarian society, small villages. Dublin was considered to be a very elegant city, but it was one of the only large cities in Ireland. And the English felt that their superior knowledge, their superior understanding of the world and how it worked would be very important for Ireland. Money, of course. There are lots of fertile farmlands that the English had already begun to take over in bits and pieces. There had been a series of wars going on between England and France and Spain. Now, France and Spain were Catholic countries, and the English feared that a Catholic Ireland might give the Spanish and the French harbours to hide their boats or assistance in other ways in those wars. So they were very, very, very keen to crush Irish Catholicism. And the other one was sectarianism, the despising of the Catholic faith, which had been subject to a lot of negative press, I suppose we'd call it today, although the press weren't necessarily involved in that, from the Anglican ascendancy in England. Now, all of this came to a head in the 16th century, 1700s, and this resulted in a series of laws. And these laws, this is not all of them, they're called the Penal Laws, and there were a lot of them. But the 1673 Test Act was an English law requiring public office holders to take Anglican communion and to reject Catholic transubstantiation, which basically barred any Catholics from government positions. And if you weren't prepared to do that, then you were punished. There were punishments that sort of started to spread out across England. Wales in particular, the Welsh were very, very keen not to give up the Catholic faith, and parts of Scotland as well. In 1728, the English disenfranchised the Irish Parliament. They basically banned the Irish Parliament. In 1793, France declared war on Britain. So that scenario I spoke to you before about, which was the fear of Catholic Ireland helping French, came into being. Now, put that little orange arrow there, you can see, because it was 1788 when Catherine McAuley was born. So she's born right into the middle of this penal law frenzy of activity. When she would have been 10 years old, or 10 or 9 or 10 years old, the Irish leaders were arrested. French ships were caught off the coast of Ireland. Shock, horror. All of the fears of the English were coming to the fore. In 1800, there was the Act of Union, which was the totally illegal annexation of Ireland as part of Britain. So that was in 1800. The second arrow there is 1827, the opening of the House of Mercy. It wasn't until 1829 that public opinion in the United Kingdom became so bad that they actually started to do something about the poverty that had been caused by the penal laws. And that was called the Roman Catholic Relief Act. And of course, just so the Irish could be just triply miserable, it was 1845 when the biggest of the famines went through Ireland, 1845, the Great Famine, which resulted in huge loss of life. Millions of people died. Millions of people left the country. And one of the things I think the Irish would never forgive the English for was in the midst of that famine, the English were still exporting food out of Ireland to England. So we can't forgive them for that in many cases, I think. So Catherine McAuley certainly lived in turbulent times, turbulent economically, turbulent politically, and it was a time when power politics and greed, the grabbing of land, the taking of all of those crops and things that they were making a lot of money out of, it inflicted poverty and loss of dignity on generations of Irish families. This is a photo from the 1800s in Ireland, but to give you an idea of the style of public housing there. So this is what the penal laws basically ensured in Ireland. First of all, and this is one that was taken up by Catherine McAuley, Nan O'Nagel, Edmund Rice, Teresa Ball, of the great Irish founders of this time, is that Catholic schooling was banned, totally banned. Catholics could go to Protestant schools, but parents had to sign oaths of allegiance to the Anglican Church for that education. The practice of the Catholic religion was also banned. And we know the stories of mass rocks being set up and mass centres being held in remote places. Priests at one stage of at this time in the early 1700s, priest hunting, and there's a picture of it there, was a popular sport, and the English would pay handsomely for every priest that was turned in. So it was a very difficult time to be a priest, and a lot of priests fled the country, usually often to France. Catholics could not own land. They could not own land. They may already own land, but they couldn't buy any more. Often, if they were renting, the land was taken over by British landlords, and the Catholics were forced to pay rent to those landlords, and often that rent was very high. They were also required to pay tithes to the Church of England. They couldn't vote. They couldn't take up any positions in public service or enter the legal profession. You couldn't possibly have Irish Catholics who had legal training, because they could obviously challenge some of these laws. And those ones who were already trained legally were not allowed to practice. They were forbidden to serve in the army. They were unable to buy land or sell land. And in another law, which was deliberately brought in, that a Catholic landholder on their death, instead of leaving the farm to one son, had to leave the farm to all of their sons. So you can imagine that the land holdings became smaller and smaller, eventually were no use to anyone. They could not support one family, and then the English landlords came in and just vacuumed up all the land. By the end of the penal laws, they say that nearly 3/4 of Irish land had changed hands to English landlords. They were obviously forbidden to carry weapons and unable to own a horse valued at more than £5. That prevented them, in a time of, obviously not a lot of public transport, of actually moving anywhere. They couldn't go from one place to the other. They had few legal protections against landlords or local authorities, who could impose arbitrary punishments and imprisonment and other violence against Catholics. And that picture there, I think, is an example of that. And we have lots of public records of punishment in the streets, people being flogged in the streets, people having being tied up in the streets and having things thrown at them. You know, it was a pretty dismal time, because much as, I shouldn't say this probably, but much as we're seeing in America, where you give some people a little bit of power, often that power is turned against the weakest people in society. And that's what was happening at this stage. So I thought we'd stop there just for a minute and think about that list of things that the penal laws forbade. And even though they only came in probably around about 1690 and were largely gone before Catherine McAuley's birth, about 1820, so we're looking about 120 years. What impact do you think these laws would have had on daily life in Ireland? Just let's take a moment to have a think about that. What impact might those laws have had on daily life? I'll put them back up again, the list. I don't know, Brenda, whether people might like to put something in the chat.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye on the chat.
Or call something out.
Yeah. Nothing so far.
Let's have a look at, well, there's some I've got here. Oh, gone back to the beginning again. Sorry about that.
So
So
Diane,
there's the
sorry, Caroline, Diane is saying the same penal laws were in effect in English ruled Newfoundland when Sisters of Mercy came to St. John's.
mm. And they were also in effect in England against Protestants, Presbyterians, anyone who wasn't of the Anglican faith. Um, I know that Mary Ward, who founded the Loretto Sisters, she was a Catholic. She lived in England, and her grandmother was sent to jail for 20 years for refusing to renounce her Catholic faith. So um, I think it was quite a widespread rule. And even in Australia, we know that the first fleet of English, when they came, um, enforced the Anglican faith on the convicts who had been sent to Australia, most of whom were Irish. Irish. And when the first two priests arrived, they were deported very quickly. So the English have tended to use the practice of religion as a way of controlling people. And I think for the Irish, um, the Catholic religion was very much part not just of their personal lives, but their communal lives, their social lives. And that made it very, very hard.
I have a couple more comments here from the chat. Starvation would have dramatically affected the physical and intellectual development of children, from Sheila.
Absolutely.
From Elaine, the laws were a complete assault on the dignity of the Irish Catholics. And Diane, many Catholics caved in for reasons of survival.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you can't blame them for that. I mean, if you're fat, it's a choice between um, holding on to your land, having your children educated or not. They say that a lot of people came back to the Catholic faith once the English were out of out of Ireland. Not that they ever went totally until almost the 1970s, but it was a very sad. So here's a couple of things that I think we could say are the impact. Definitely the degrading and squalid living conditions. This was something that Catherine McAuley saw every day. The House of Mercy was built on Bagot Street, which was a fairly upmarket area. We know that she deliberately built the house amongst the wealthy. But if you went down the back of Bagot Street, there were slums and tenements and squalid living conditions, and a lot of families pushed into housing because housing was not affordable. There was a census done in the early 1830s of Irish housing, and on the census they had 4 levels of housing. The fourth one was no windows, earth floors, poor ventilation, damp and things like that. And 3/4 of Irish housing came in that level. That was in the 1830s. There's absolutely no social infrastructure. There was no support for the elderly. There was no support for widows, things like that. We know there was overcrowding and, sorry, that's going on its own. We know there was overcrowding and filthy streets, polluted canals and rivers. So even if you wanted clean water, often you couldn't get it. One of the causes of the cholera epidemic that flew through Dublin over a number of different years was polluted water. So typhus, TB, smallpox, and cholera. And of course, in these days, it was before a lot of the medical breakthroughs had started to link things like cholera and dirty water, TB, and the viruses that cause people's lungs to block up, the smallpox, and how that spread between people. So these people who are living in very, very overcrowded houses were, sitting ducks for a lot of this disease. In Dublin in the late 1700s, early 1800s, you wouldn't be sure that your children were going to live until adulthood. Huge infant mortality rates, children living in conditions that were just unhygienic, cold, and they died in high numbers. And we know even from Catherine McAuley's life, if you think, she lost many of her family members, children, to diseases such as this. And some of the early sisters who were only young were dying of TB. We know that violence was rife. Again, as I said before, when you give people a little bit of power, they often will take violent action, excessive punishments, a lot of petty crime and vagrancy, because that's the only way people had to live. Begging was a national pastime, I think. Prisons were full and shocking in their conditions, and often the treatment of women in prisons was appalling. I don't need to go into the details of that, but some of the records of female prisons at this time are shocking. We know that alcohol was abused. We know that domestic violence and the sexual abuse of children was also part of the social landscape. Ignorance in the sense of there was the education. When we talk about the lack of education, by Catherine's time, not just the parents, but also the grandparents had come through a time when they had limited education. They couldn't read, so they didn't know what they were signing off, and if they're signing leases on houses. They couldn't write. They didn't understand much of the stuff that was going on. They had lost a lot of their stories, a lot of their cultural understandings. So the penal laws were designed to destroy the Irish Catholic population, to render them people without hope. It was a deliberate and vicious campaign. And in many ways, Catherine McAuley, when she walked outside the door at Coolock or came into Dublin, would have seen every day these things that I've listed here in the streets. So this is what Henry Inglis wrote. I'll let you read that yourself. About, he spent a day in Dublin. He went there to check out for himself if it was true what he was reading. When you think of ourselves today and what we class as comfortable in our living conditions, we would say a comfortable bed to sleep in, somewhere to cook our food, somewhere that's safe, dry, well ventilated, probably in many ways. Those are sort of the basics that human dignity would demand. The Irish Catholics in many parts of Dublin, I'm saying all of them, but in many parts of Dublin, did not have any of those guarantees in their accommodation in the places that they lived. They didn't have access to clothes. Quite often clothes were shared. If you had to go out, you might have to wear somebody else's clothes. Quite often there were rags. I was reading that 1831 census again the other day, and they were saying that on average, most people in the country, we're not talking about Dublin now, but in the country, the women and children had no coats and often no shoes. Don't know about you, but Dublin's pretty chilly at certain times of the year. But shoes were just impossible to buy when you had no money. So I think Catherine McAuley's response, obviously, was to offer education to girls. And when you think about that response, she was, in a way, a visionary. She knew that education would give a future. She knew that it was the only way of social advancement. Education would provide women with money to support a family. Education would eventually lead to better housing and health outcomes. We know that. And of course, the education that she sought to give, not just reading and writing and matters of faith, were things that could be useful for women going on. And I was thinking about that old saying, it takes a village to raise a child out of poverty. Catherine McAuley and the women who came to work with her, there were other people in Dublin who were trying very hard to do the same thing. The Loreto sisters, the Sisters of Charity, the Christian Brothers were operating schools on the other side of the river for boys in similar situations. There were a lot of people who saw this need and were working towards it. But it was a huge, huge challenge when you think about the numbers of destitute people, the numbers of destitute women, the prostitution and the problems of that, and just the need to build houses or to get houses to a standard where they were actually fit for human habitation. And that was something that took many, many years. I don't know if any of you have been to Dublin, but if you go to Dublin, you can visit a place called 14 Henrietta Street, and it's an old tenement building. It was the home of one family when the Parliament was in Dublin. When the Parliament left Dublin to go to England, these houses were basically abandoned, and they were taken over by unscrupulous landlords, of course. And in that house at one time, there were 109 people living there. That's 13 or 14 different families. Each of the rooms of that house were turned into a place, and some of those families had 10 or 11 children. And the places were squalid, they were cold, they were crowded. This was the housing of Dublin for many, many years. When you put something like the penal laws in place, it takes a long time for the conditions to improve. And I would suggest it wasn't probably until the 1900s, probably the mid-1900s, that Irish people were able to finally achieve housing outcomes that the rest of the world might have said, that's a decent place for someone to live.
Caroline, before you move on, I have a comment and a question from Barbara. The first convent founded in Bermondsey was also situated amongst the slum dock area of London. It was the area that Charles Dickens used to place the scene of Oliver Twist. And Elaine is asking, in what year were the penal laws repealed?
They were gone basically by the before Catherine opened, so probably early 1820s. They were just like they were brought in one by one. They were actually repealed slowly, but they were pretty much gone by the 1830s. What was left then was the result of what they had done.
One of them wasn't repealed until 2025. It was the use of the Irish language in courts in the UK, and that was finally repealed in February of 2025.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was reading something about the use of the Irish language. Of course, the English banned the use of the Irish language. And children who were caught using it they used to wear a sort of like a stick around their neck and under their arms, and they would put a notch in the stick. And every time they used the Irish language, that would be a beating that they would receive. It was a way of stamping out, I suppose, their cultural heritage, but also the English couldn't have people speaking Irish because they didn't know what they were saying about them. So they were very adamant in doing that. But yeah, thank you for that. Who contributed that? I'm going to write that down. You learn something new every day. Okay, so Catherine, I think to just think about this time in history, Catherine McAuley started it, but she didn't just help the kids. She didn't just open the schools. She took in neglected children. The top floors of Bagot Street, there were places. There was a whole, I suppose, at the length of Bagot Street, places for women and children to sleep who had nowhere else, and the neglected children could sleep. We know she adopted 9 children herself and brought them up. She had a particular outreach to prostitutes. And in my next session, which is on the social poverty of Dublin, I'll talk a little bit about prostitutes and the way that they were treated, and the whole notion of the deserving and the undeserving poor that was going on at the time. It said she knew all the prostitutes who were plying their trade along the banks of the canal. Prisoners, particularly prisoners, women who'd come out of prison and had nowhere else to go, were welcome in the House of Mercy. Debtors, and debtors were the undeserving poor as far as the English were concerned, and were thrown into prison. Elderly people who were often neglected or left behind or too weak to move. The sick, Catherine and the early sisters, they had a ministry to the sick and the dying. And I think, sorry, this keeps jumping around, but it's moving. It's said that Catherine McAuley, when she entered into some of those awful places, those slums, would never buy anything on her face or any action, have any reaction to the smell or the sights that she was seeing. She came, she was a presence, she sat with people, she helped them where she could. Because one of the things about laws like this is they strip you of hope, they strip you of dignity. And I don't know about you, but if someone was coming into my place and I had nothing, I was wearing nothing but rags, my place, was littered with rubbish, there was sewage in the streets outside, I wouldn't want people to see that. So Catherine had a way of making people not unashamed of themselves, but accepted them where they are. Those were destitute, orphans, all of those people were helped. And all those people needed help. And one of the things Catherine often writes is there were so many people who needed help. Whichever new foundation she was setting up, whether it was Birr or Limerick, or Carlow or Bermondsey or Birmingham, there were so many poor people there who needed her help. And I think she probably suffered what we would say like that overload. You can't help everyone. But I think in her heart, and I think this is something that she engendered in her sisters, is you can make a difference to one at a time. One at a time. And as I said, everywhere she went, the poverty was dire. And that's a direct result of 100 years of laws which were designed to achieve just that end. So I think Catherine McAuley, in a way, she was a woman of her time. She'd grown up in a wealthy home despite the poverty around her. She had been educated. She had a relatively supportive family. She could have chosen a different life direction. She had a strong faith, and she had strong connections to country and community. And this was all unusual for her time. But one of the reasons she was able to do what she could do is that she had some of these advantages around her. And many of the women who came to work with her had also been educated, had also had supportive families, also came from homes that had some money. So amongst those who were terribly poor, there was that group, but then there were groups of women and groups of others, men as well, who were coming from families that weren't as bad as that, who wanted to do something about it. So I think that that was her benefit. But she did show, I think, extraordinary emotional, spiritual, and social intelligence in knowing, in looking around, seeing the desperation and the poverty, and knowing that education was a start. Visitation, education, then into health. She's famously reported to have said, "The poor need help today, not next week." She knew the need to act, whatever you did. Sitting around having an inquiry into poverty was not something that she would have gone along with. She did have a strong support group. We do criticize some of the clergy in her story, but there were others who did support her. Among them, in funny sorts of ways, the Archbishop Daniel Murray. She was supported by the great liberator Daniel O'Connell to an extent. He also supported the work of the Christian Brothers on the other side of the river. And people from her childhood, family groups helped her as well. She did have that disposition to be able to step in. She did firmly believe in the importance of educating women. Nothing is more important than the prudent education of women. But I'd like to finish by saying, in the light of the penal laws, even though she was never directly at risk of being arrested, like some of the earlier founders, like Nana Nagel, she was nevertheless courageous in her capacity to stand up against what was happening, her capacity to plan ahead, and her creativity and resilience at a time that, I think, if I was walking the streets of Dublin in 1827, what I would be seeing around me would be sad. It would be disheartening. But she took that and she worked with it and she made a difference. So that's how I'd like to finish. I mean, the penal laws are not a nice group of laws to talk about. As I said, they were deliberate, they were intentional, and their intention was to degrade, to grind down, to destroy, really, the Irish people. People like Catherine McAuley stood up and said, "We'll educate women, we'll take care of the sick, we'll look after the poor, we will make a difference in our own little place," in every place she went to, and that's made a huge difference. And she wasn't constrained by social expectations. I mean, a person of Catherine's background would have been expected to marry, have children, make alliances, but no, she wasn't going to be constrained. She had a job. And in many ways, she was a social mystic, a spiritual mystic in a way. Like, she had a sense that God was calling her to something greater. And we should all be thankful for that. So, thank you, Brenda. We might slip out of thingy
I have
mode now.
another comment here from Anne. In other areas of the British Empire, the repeal of the laws depended on the whim of governors and the effective establishment of representative government. In Newfoundland, the Relief Act was made effective in 1784 and the repeal was made effective in 1832.
Yeah.
Long time.
Yeah. And the repealing of the Act was all very well, but nothing was put in place to deal with the impact of the Acts. You know, the loss of land, the widespread movement of people to cities, the overcrowding, the disease, the desperation. And I think that in many ways the British, they were forced to repeal the Acts from a lot of pressure that was coming on them, but they did nothing to repeal the impact of the Acts. That was often left to people like Catherine McAuley and the early foundresses of those places in Ireland and England that she went, in Newfoundland and eventually to the US. She certainly took a stand, and I hope that I know that some of the English eventually accepted that things needed to be done, but it took them a long time to get there. So, any other comments?
I have a comment from Margaret. Thanks, Caroline. I'm looking forward to your other offerings, and I've just shared the link. If anyone hasn't registered for webinar 2, I've shared the link in the chat there. And we're back. So if anybody else wants to ask a question, I've unmuted. I've gone around and muted a few people, but if anybody else wants to come in, just raise your virtual hand or wave at us, or
but I'm seeing a lot of Irish history coming through on some of the social media at the moment. It must be the anniversary of Catholic emancipation. Is it this year? I'm not sure what it is, but lots of comments about the penal laws have been coming up, which I've read with great interest. So, yeah. And I'm not saying, that Ireland is the only place that's ever been impacted by horrible things like this. As I said before, the treatment of the Indian populations by the English, the British Empire was appalling, as was the treatment of some of the African countries. Certainly the Australian Indigenous wouldn't have any good things to say about that either. So I think the penal laws are one example of man's inhumanity to man. And it's only that good people like your Dan O'Nagels and your Catherine McAuleys and your Mary Aikenheads stood up to make the lives of the people that they touched a little bit better. And I suppose that's a lesson for all of us, isn't it? If we can make the lives of people around us a little bit better, then we've probably done a good merciful life. It's been lovely to. I can't see. I hate talking to people I can't see, but it's been lovely talking to you. I hope you've got a bit of a understanding of the penal laws, or a bit of there's quite comment there. A bit of an appreciation of the enormous effort that those early Sisters of Mercy put in all those places they went to.
Vicky has shared a comment. Vicky from Cincinnati, wanting you to know her mom was a war bride who met her Marine dad when he was sent to Australia for arrest during World War II. But from that background, she grew up knowing about Irish deported to Australia as criminals. Thanks, Vicky.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And yeah, but we have a very strong Irish Celtic element to our population. We certainly celebrate St. Patrick's Day with gusto and green beer. And yeah, I think the Irish are the backbone of early Australia. Certainly a lot of our young in small towns and outback places were founded by the Irish. And you go to art places in Australia and you see Bagot Street and you see Dublin Road, like very, very Irish background. But anyway, I'll stop talking now. But if anyone make any final comments, Brenda and I'll certainly read those. I'm starting to see some people.
Caroline, when you were speaking, am I unmuted yet? When you were speaking of the whole thing of the language, being restricted from the language, very similar here in Newfoundland, Canada, when our Innu and Inuit people were restricted speaking the Inuaman and Inuktitut, same, very similar, yeah.
Yeah, I think stripping people of their religion, their language, were the two sort of key tools, I suppose, of despots. I mean, it's happening even today, or their name, when you say you're a number, which they did, they've done all around the world when they've tried to take over places. So you're right, Eileen, it's a horrific thing to do. But
and they're bringing back the language in a way that when the new babies are born, they give the baby to the grandparents, because normally the mothers or fathers are working, but they don't have the language, just the grandparents have it. So they're giving the children during the day to the grandparents, and then they speak the language. So that's how they're reviving the language now.
It's great. That's really great. Yeah. I mean, I know a lot of languages have been lost, but I'm always in part if there's anyone from New Zealand on tonight, but the Maori in New Zealand, the language is used not just by Indigenous people, but all people. They'll speak Maori, not so much in Australia, although I know Indigenous languages are being taught. But again, it's a really important thing. It's part of the core of who you are as a person. Your language, your religion, your name. So if you want to enslave a group of people, it's the way to do it. Oh, here there is someone from New Zealand. My sisters. So I didn't read the end of that. Did you get the end of that, Brenda?
No, it hasn't come up yet. It might be a direct message to you, but I don't see it here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay. From Emma, thank you, Caroline. Very interesting and informative. I appreciated the text and images, and looking forward to the next session. So on that note, the next session is, as I said, I've shared the link there. It's on Wednesday, the 24th of June. I hope I've gotten the date right. But we'll send a reminder out to you a couple of days beforehand, so you don't have to go looking for the Zoom. And if you've any feedback or comment on today's session that you want to share with myself or Caroline, our emails are Caroline Thompson at mercyinternational.ie or Brenda Drum at mercyinternational.ie. So I'm going to press stop on the recording by saying thanks again. Caroline, final words to you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. And hopefully when we do these history talks, there'll be something that you can use again, or in your own ministries and things like that. And hopefully, if there's something you'd like us to cover, I mean, half an hour is not much to do justice to Irish history, but I'm happy to present on that topic. I'll just need a little bit of time to read up on it. The next one is on poverty in Catherine's time, which sort of builds on what we've done today. And the one after that's a little bit of a look at Bagot Street throughout history, which I'll give you one clue. It used to be called Gallows Road, which might suggest to you what it might have been used for in early times. But anyway, that's the third one, which will be coming down the line for you probably in, is it August? Brenda? Anyway, I can't remember. But
July. The next two, June and July. I've had a question here before. I know I said you were having the last word, Caroline, but I've had a couple of questions. Okay. The recordings will be available on request by email, and we'll also be sending them out with Mercy E-News, which is going out. The next Mercy E-News is going out on Thursday, so we'll include the link in that. So if you're not subscribed, now's your chance to subscribe on the bottom of the homepage. But if anybody needs it before Thursday, just drop myself or Caroline a message and we'll send it out to you. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Kia ora from New Zealand.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Mary. Kia ora.
It's Tuesday morning now.
Oh, is it?